Doug left the hospital in a state of disorientation, the alcohol mixing with the scent of antiseptic and the psychological pressure making each step unsteady, like the plans brewing in his head, ready to explode. After weeks of silently observing Joey, he believed he had the trump card to reverse the tide, to make the man he blamed for pushing his life into a corner pay the price. Doug wasn't just dreaming of revenge. He longed to prove himself as the true power player in the game where he had long been a pawn. Vanessa's presence in this story was a fragile line between reason and chaos. She wasn't a stranger to the silent battles fought in hospital hallways, to the secrets hidden behind secure doors. Vanessa didn't trust Doug, but she also understood the danger of alerting Joey too blatantly. Her warning on August 7th wasn't out of compassion, but survival instinct. She knew exactly what Joey was like. A man who could endure but never forget, ready to retaliate in ways that would leave his opponent blindsided. When Vanessa revealed that Joey had placed a listening device in Doug's car, it meant that every threat, every plan, and even every reckless impulse could be exposed. But for Doug, this truth ignited a feeling of being cornered. He wasn't just playing a dangerous game, he was being forced to reveal his cards earlier than planned. In a world where every choice led to unpredictable consequences, Doug chose to trust his own impulsiveness. He didn't back down after Vanessa's warning. In fact, her interference only made him believe he was getting closer to Joey's weakness. Doug no longer cared about his own safety or the consequences that would follow. He began drawing Randy into the story deliberately, as if setting a trap not just for Joey but for Randy as well, a naive or too trusting soul to understand that he was being used as part of a personal revenge chess game. Doug didn't tell the whole truth. He merely sowed half of the story, pushing Randy into a world of doubt and chaos. This not only diverted Joey's attention but also created layers to obscure the real motives behind Doug's reckless actions. Randy, unwittingly, became the sacrificial pawn or shield for a plan with an uncertain end. Meanwhile, Joey wasn't taking anything for granted. He had long been used to the knives in his back. So placing a listening device in Doug's car wasn't a sign of fear, but a strategic defensive move. Joey knew Doug wasn't clever enough to hide his emotions. He would speak, he would act impulsively, and that's all Joey needed, time and evidence. But what Joey didn't expect was the persistence of a man who had lost everything. Doug was no longer bound by conscience or honor. He wasn't looking to negotiate or settle. He wanted destruction, not just of Joey's career but his very character. In Doug's mind, exposing Joey was no longer a personal act. It had become a life goal, a salvation for his shattered self-respect. Vanessa, the outsider, found herself increasingly drawn into the whirlpool. Though she had warned Doug, she knew that words were meaningless now. Doug had chosen the path of confrontation, and she had only two options left: either withdraw completely or find a way to control the damage before everything became irreparable. Vanessa's silence in the days that followed wasn't abandonment, but calculation. She began quietly gathering pieces of information, not to help Doug, but to save herself. The war between Doug and Joey was no longer just their own. It was spreading, seeping into every relationship, every secret of those around them, pulling in links that seemed unrelated. While Doug sank deeper into his blackmail plan, using bits of information he believed were valuable to bargain, Joey remained eerily calm on the outside. He didn't react immediately, didn't show any sign of wavering. But behind that silence was a storm building, waiting for the right moment to sweep away everything Doug had been trying to build. Joey didn't need to speak, because he had the power, the connections, and above all, the patience of a man who had survived more battles than Doug could imagine. Doug's involvement of Randy could turn everything around, or it could spiral out of control. Randy wasn't good at hiding his emotions, and with a small slip-up, Joey would trace every lead. Doug knew this, but he had no other choice. He was betting everything on the belief that Joey would make a mistake first, that his overconfidence would make him careless. But life is rarely so simple. When trust and desperation mix, the lines between right and wrong, good and evil begin to blur. Doug was no longer the devoted doctor, the husband, or the father full of hopes. He had become a man willing to lose everything just to prove that he still had control over his own fate. And on the other side, Joey, cold, silent, was like a predator waiting in the shadows, waiting for his prey to collapse from exhaustion or overconfidence. Beyond the gates was no longer just a story about schemes and revenge. It was the slow, painful unraveling of a human mind under strain, a collision between survival instincts and the lust for power. Doug, Vanessa, Randy, and Joey, none of them could remain innocent. Each person was pulled in, and every decision led to a consequence larger than they could ever have imagined. And now, with everything beyond the point of no return, the only thing left was to wait and see who would fall first, and who would be the last standing when the final gate closed. Doug had never been one to control his anger well. For him, betrayal wasn't just a wound to his pride. It was a direct punch to everything he had once believed to be stable and true. When he learned that Joey had not only pushed him into a gambling debt, but had also secretly inserted himself into the fragile relationship between Doug and Vanessa, a part of his reasoning finally shattered. The presence of the bug in his car had now become the only ally he trusted. Doug was no longer seeking justice. He was seeking destruction, and if he had to burn everything to achieve that, he was ready to strike the match. But his strongest weapon lay in Randy, an unstable variable, someone too innocent or too shrewd for Doug to fully read. Randy had once been seen as an outsider in the power games, a nobody walking among the bigger shadows, but that very status made him the perfect target to be lured in or manipulated unknowingly. Doug first approached Randy under the guise of a fellow ally with a shared enemy. He planted in Randy's mind an image of a ruthless Joey, distorted the truth, and masked emotions to create a perfect villain in the eyes of someone who lived through feeling. Doug spun a tale of cursed debts, dirty tricks at the casino, and the painful betrayal of emotions, painting Vanessa as a pawn being manipulated rather than an accomplice. Doug didn't know how much of this Randy truly believed, but it was enough for him to care, to ask questions, and to stay and listen instead of turning away. It was this silence that became the crack through which Doug slid his intentions. However, Randy wasn't as simple as Doug thought. There were nights Randy wandered around Joey's mansion, not out of curiosity, but to verify whether what Doug had said was true or just part of a bigger play. Randy wasn't easily manipulated. He played the role of the intermediary, the one who knew everything but didn't speak. He kept himself in the gray area, not siding with Doug, but not nodding to Joey's power or charm either. If Doug thought he was leading Randy, he was wrong. Randy had his own reasons for observing, for understanding, and possibly for punishing both when he realized he was nothing more than a pawn. As Doug thought about his next move, the idea of breaking into Joey's house slowly became an obsession. He imagined every door, every drawer, every electronic device he could plant a bug in or steal information from. Doug believed that the evidence didn't lie in words exchanged, but in data, images, and transactions carefully stored away, things Joey never thought anyone would have the courage to take. But to break in successfully, he needed someone on the inside, someone close enough, or at least someone trusted enough to enter the mansion without raising suspicion. Randy, once again, became the ideal link in this bold chain of actions. Doug began mentioning small details, hinting at the possibility that if they could get into Joey's house, even for just a few minutes, they could expose everything. He didn't ask directly. He merely suggested, but that suggestion was laced with clear pressure. Doug was testing the waters, waiting to see how Randy would react to the prospect of becoming an accomplice in a risky venture. At the same time, Doug didn't rule out other avenues of attack. He began digging through Joey's old relationships, former employees, business partners, even regular patrons from the casino. Each person had a story, a rumor, or a time they had been wronged, and Doug jotted it all down. Not everything was useful, but just one weakness, evidence of money laundering, fraud, or bribery, and he would have enough fire to burn the moral mask Joey had carefully built. Meanwhile, Vanessa remained silent but kept a watchful eye. She didn't assist but also didn't intervene. Vanessa knew that Joey could be dangerous, but she also saw Doug's instability becoming more apparent. A man who had once been loving and devoted was now becoming a ghost, wandering between the lines of good and evil. She began to question whether she had inadvertently pushed him into the abyss or if he had already been carrying that destructive fire within him, waiting for someone to light the match. Randy, standing at the crossroads, didn't rush to make a decision. He could continue pretending not to know anything, quietly observing while waiting for the right moment to act. But he could also be preparing a counterattack that no one expected. For in this world full of lies, the silent ones weren't outsiders. They were the ones accumulating power in their own way. If Doug broke into Joey's house, he might find evidence, but the cost would be shattering the last remaining shell he had left. If he stopped, everything he had built would fall into nothingness. In the tug of war between action and consequence, Doug may not realize that the chess game he thought he was playing had likely been designed by someone else long ago, and Randy, instead of being the pawn, could be the one silently rearranging the whole board according to his own rules. Doug finally entered the action phase of the revenge plan he had been nursing for weeks. Under the dim streetlights of the luxurious mansion area, he quietly watched the movements of familiar figures, appearing and disappearing in their predictable but vulnerable orbits. He spent each night analyzing Joey's schedule, counting the cars coming and going, and memorizing every small detail in the brief encounters with casino staff or Joey's close associates. Doug didn't act hastily. He waited, prepared, and when everything seemed stable, he decided to strike on Thursday night, the time Joey usually left for late shareholder meetings and didn't return until the early morning hours. Randy, at that point, was still seen by Doug as the silent supporting link, someone who would distract the surveillance system or simply open the gate at the right moment to allow Doug to slip in from the back. But things didn't go as planned. An unexpected incident occurred as soon as Doug approached the parking area. A small noise, like the clink of a glass lid falling, rang out, causing a dog in the area to bark loudly. Doug, keeping his cool, quickly found a hiding spot, but from afar, motion-sensing lights immediately illuminated a part of the backyard, making his silhouette almost visible in those few short seconds. Worse still, the security camera that he thought had been disabled with Randy's help was still functioning normally. Doug silently withdrew, but when he returned to the meeting point, an abandoned parking lot behind an old supermarket, he found no trace of Randy. Instead, there was a heavy silence, a message that simply read, "I'm sorry, I can't continue." That was all Doug received before discovering that Randy's phone had been completely turned off. In that moment, all the doubts he had previously dismissed about Randy suddenly became clear, like a mirror being wiped clean of dust. Doug felt the cold run down his spine not because of the night wind, but because he realized he might have walked right into a trap. It wasn't Joey who had set the trap, but Randy, the one person he thought might share part of the goal and resentment. Doug began connecting the dots he had once deliberately overlooked. Randy's hesitation every time Joey's name came up, the long silences whenever Doug proposed a new move, and even the seemingly innocent questions about the device, the routes, or the habits. Now, each fragment appeared as a warning he had ignored. Inside Doug was a storm that could not be named. Anger, disappointment, and a touch of panic. For if Randy had truly betrayed him and sided with Joey, it meant that the entire plan, from the bug in the car to the list of Joey's weaknesses, could have been exposed. Joey wasn't someone who would stop at just defense. He would attack, clean up all traces, and, most importantly, make Doug the guilty party. In Joey's world, revenge never came openly. It was always subtle, thorough, and left no escape route. Doug was no longer in the driver's seat. He had to dismantle the devices, delete the stored files, and disappear before Joey struck. But what broke him was not the danger of being exposed, but the betrayal. Doug had once believed that Randy was the only one who understood the feeling of being crushed by Joey, the one with enough integrity to resist the corrupt power circle swallowing the vulnerable. But perhaps Randy had chosen the more practical path, standing with the strong, the safe, the one who would protect him from the dangers Doug was igniting. Randy didn't make his reasons clear, But it was that silence that was more ruthless than any explanation. For in this fight, silence was denial, was the choice to stay out and watch the one who trusted him fall into despair. And as Doug walked through the night, clutching the phone that hadn't quite turned off, he knew that this time he was truly alone. No more Randy, no more Vanessa, no one at his side. The game was no longer about revenge. It was about survival. And if he had to flip the chessboard again, Doug wouldn't need any allies. He would do it alone, at any cost.